Shalom, welcome back. We're picking up in our Revelation Fulfilled series. We're on chapter 12. As I've said in the previous videos, I'm using a couple of books as a guide, putting this series of presentations together. The first one is The Mystery is History by Adam Drissel, and Back to the Future by Ralph Bass. Both of these are highly recommended. They're both very good books. My views don't necessarily reflect the views of the authors. I know we do have theological differences, but both of these books are a pretty good guide as far as the historical fulfillment goes. Okay, first verse of chapter 12. A great sign was seen in the heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was with child. She cried out in pain, laboring to give birth. Okay, so one of the patterns that we see here in the book of Revelation is that John is making reference to various prophecies in the Old Testament. And these prophecies, when you see one of them referenced in the book of Revelation, you go back to that prophecy, and it gives you some insight into what John is trying to say. Kind of how to decode the book of Revelation, and chapter 12 in general is no different. There's several prophecies that he refers to, and so by following the breadcrumbs back to the original prophecy and looking at it, you should be able to get some more details. And so this passage here is no different. This description of the woman should bring to mind Joseph's dream from the book of Genesis. Genesis 37:9, he dreamt yet another dream and told it to his brothers and said, Behold, I have dreamed yet another dream, and behold, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars bound down to me. And his father, or he told it to his father and his brothers, and his father rebuked him and said to him, What is this dream that you have dreamed? Will I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves down to you, to the earth? So, in Joseph's dream, the sun represents Israel, the moon is Rachel, and the 12 stars are the 12 tribes. You may wonder who the woman is in the beginning of chapter 12 of Revelation. Well, that woman is going to be revealed shortly, but her name is Zion. And we'll see that as we get a little bit further in. So, going on to verse 3, and another sign was seen in the heavens. Behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his head 7 crowns. His tail drew 1/3 of the stars of the sky, and threw them to the earth. The dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she gave birth, he might devour her child. Now, we know who the dragon is. It is Satan. We're told so just a few verses later. And we also know who the stars are. We just established that. The stars are the tribes of Israel. So if we stay consistent with what the first 2 verses of this chapter are telling us, then we should expect 4 tribes to be symbolically thrown to the earth. So from our chart in the first video, remember that something falling from heaven or something thrown to the earth represent being consumed by war. So this tail of the dragon should be dragging 4 out of the 12 tribes, because you got 12 tribes, and 1/3 of the stars, 1/3 of the tribes would be 4. So we would expect the dragon to be consuming 4 of these tribes by war. So if we look at the path that Vespasian and Titus took while conquering Galilee, it was in the biblical territories of Naphtali, Asher, Zebulun, and Issachar. John was telling us that 1/3 of the land would be destroyed by war, or 1/3 of the tribal allotments would be destroyed by war. So you may ask, well, why was it the dragon's tail that was destroying these 4 tribes? And it's because as the dragon turns toward Jerusalem, everything behind it was a path of destruction. And so, the tail would be behind the dragon. And that's where the destruction was. Here's a couple of maps. The map on the left is the tribal allotments. The map on the right is the path that Vespasian and Titus took, and as you can see, the territories of those 4 tribes is what is being hit by the destruction from Vespasian's war machine. All right, verse 5. She gave birth to a son, a male child, who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. Her child was caught up to God and to his throne. The woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, that they may nourish her 1,260 days. Okay, so this male child is obviously Yeshua. So this woman, Zion, gives birth to a son, a male child, who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. Again, of course, that's Yeshua. Then he's caught up to God and to his throne. Again, you're talking about Yeshua. Then the woman fled to the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by Elohim, that they may nourish her for 1,260 days. So the 1,260 days is the length of time in which this war is going on. And this, of course, is referring back to another prophecy. And this one is in Isaiah chapter 66. Before she travailed, she gave birth. Before her pain came, she delivered a son. Some translations say a man-child, which, of course, reflects what's said in Revelation. So, again, this is Yeshua, the male child. And it says, who has heard such a thing? Who has seen such things? Shall a land be born in one day? Shall a nation be born at once? For as soon as Zion travailed, she gave birth to her children. So now you have the revelation of who the woman is. And you can see that there's 2 births going on. You have Zion giving birth to a son, and then you have Zion giving birth to her children, which would be, of course, the Christian nation. So again, this verse is not referring to, as some people will say, they say, oh, well, this is referring to the Rothschild, Edomite occupied land in the Middle East. This is not some modern day Talmudic paradise. This is the biblical Zion. This is the nation that was given birth by the coming of Messiah and then the destruction of Jerusalem. But for our purposes, this is really about these 2 births. And so the second birth was the children, the believers in Yeshua. Now, I'm not going to read the rest of Isaiah 66. Yeah, you can read it if you want to, but you'll notice it continues with words of comfort to Yahweh's people, but judgment to the rebellious, to the wicked. And that's exactly what we're going to see throughout this chapter of Revelation, and really, to some extent, the whole book of Revelation. There's two people groups. There's one people group that is protected. It would be believers in Yeshua, and then there are the wicked, the rebellious, that are destroyed. Okay, so back to Revelation. There was a war in the sky. Michael and his angels made war on the dragon. The dragon and his angels made war. They didn't prevail. Neither was a place found for him any more in heaven. The great dragon was thrown down, the old serpent, he who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, now is salvation, the power, and the kingdom of our God, and the authority of his Messiah has come. For the accusers of our brothers has been thrown down, who accuses them before God day and night. They overcame him because of the Lamb's blood and because of the word of their testimony. They didn't love their life even to death. Therefore rejoice, heavens, and you who dwell in them. Woe to the earth and to the sea, because the devil has gone down to you, having great wrath, knowing that he has but a short time. Okay, so this mention of Michael is meant to drag us back to Daniel. So you have this reference to Michael. You also have the description of the dragon with his 7 heads and 10 horns. It's very reminiscent of Daniel's prophecies also. So we're going to look at that in a moment. I do want to point out, it says that woe to the earth and sea. As we know from the chart at the beginning of this video series, the earth and the sea represent the earth specifically represents like the lower class of people, the common person, and then the sea would be like the mass of humanity, like an entire nation. So this is who is coming against, that the devil's going against. I do want to just remind you that we have several testimonies. One, for instance, here is Josephus, from ancient Roman and Jewish historians, that mention seeing chariots and troops of soldiers in their armor running about the heavens during the destruction of Jerusalem. So there is also a literal fulfillment aspect of this. When Michael was fighting with the devil, that people did actually see this war occurring in the clouds. Okay, so we'll get to Daniel. Daniel 12 is where you see the mention of Michael, but we're going to back up just a little bit and read the end of Daniel 11, because I do believe that this has a lot to do with Vespasian. It said, "The king shall do according to his will, and he shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods. He shall prosper until the indignation is accomplished. For that which is determined shall be done. Neither shall he regard the gods of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any god, for he shall magnify himself above all. But in his place shall he honor the God of fortresses, and a God whom his fathers did not know shall he honor with gold, and silver, and with precious stones, and pleasant things. He shall deal with the strongest fortresses by the help of a foreign god. Whoever acknowledges him, he will increase with glory, and he shall cause them to rule over many, and shall divide the land for a price." Okay, so this is mentioned in the book, The History is Mystery, and Adam Driscoll makes a really good case that the person being spoken about, this king of the north, is actually Vespasian, and he is able to reference several historical documents that seem to describe Vespasian in similar terms as to what is being said here by Daniel, describing this king of the north. And he makes a really good case for that being the case, for it being Vespasian that's being written about here. So there's several qualities or descriptive traits that we are told here in Daniel to look for in this king of the north. Not all of these can be found directly. For instance, speaking against the God of gods, which you would presume to be Yahweh. We don't have proof of that specifically, but there's enough of these different traits that he does connect to Vespasian. And I think he makes a pretty good case for this being who Daniel's referring to. So first we'll turn to Suetonius, Vespasian chapter 7. It says, "Therefore, beginning a civil war and sending ahead generals with troops to Italy, he crossed meanwhile into Alexandria to take possession of the key of Egypt. There he dismissed all his attendants and entered the temple of Serapis alone to consult the auspices as to the duration of his power. And when after many propitiatory offerings to the god, he at length turned about, it seemed to him that his freedman, Bastiles, offered him sacred boughs, garlands, and loaves, as is the custom there. Yet he knew well that no one had let him in, and that for some time he had been hardly able to walk by reason of rheumatism, and was besides far away. And immediately letters came with the news that Vitellius had been routed at Cremona, and the emperor himself was slain at Rome." So here you see that he is entering this temple of Serapis. He is making offerings to the god, which is what we saw mentioned in Daniel. And he obviously, like, walking into this temple is of course, a very prideful thing. It would be kind of the same idea as someone walking, like Pompey walking into the Holy of Holies in Jerusalem in 63 BC. This is very kind of high-handed, prideful, going into where you don't belong, and that's what you see going on here. Suetonius goes on. It says, Vespasian as yet lacked prestige and a certain divinity, so to speak, since he was an unexpected and still new made emperor. But these also were given him. A man of the people who was blind and another who was lame came to him together as he sat on the tribunal, begging for the help for their disorders, which Serapis had promised in a dream. For the god declared that Vespasian would restore the eyes if he would spit upon them and give strength to the leg, if he would deign to touch it with his heel. Though he had hardly any faith that this could possibly succeed, and therefore shrank even from making the attempt, he was at last prevailed upon by his friends, and tried both things in public before a large crowd with success. At this same time, by the direction of certain soothsayers, some vases of antique workmanship were dug up at a consecrated spot in Tegea in Arcadia, and on them was the very image like Vespasian. You also see either a very similar or possibly the same story related by Tacitus. It says, in the months during which Vespasian was waiting at Alexandria for the periodical return of the summer gales and settled weather at sea, many wonders occurred which seemed to point him out as the object of the favor of heaven and of the partiality of the gods. One of the common people of Alexandria, well known for his blindness, threw himself at the emperor's knees and implored him with groans to heal his infirmity. This he did by the advice of the god Serapis, whom this nation, devoted as it is to many superstitions, worships more than any other divinity. And so Vespasian, supposing that all things were possible to his good fortune, and that nothing was any longer past belief, with a joyful countenance, amid the intense expectation of the multitude of bystanders, accomplished what was required. The hand was instantly restored to its use, and the light of day again shone upon the blind. Persons actually present attest both facts, even now, when nothing is to be gained by falsehood. Okay, so the god Serapis is mentioned in both of these accounts. Serapis is an Egyptian god, not a Roman god. So it fits this description of a god whom his fathers did not know. Also, this concept of him exalting himself above of all the, every god. In fact, there's even, I've noticed, of course, there is the similarity between the healing that Vespasian performed in front of this crowd and some of the healings that is mentioned with regards to Yeshua. So there is definitely this idea of Vespasian taking on this role of being a god himself. Now, I began looking into this god Serapis, and I found something really interesting. I did some videos a while back that spoke, it was basically sharing with you some research that someone else had done where they believed that Luke was actually Plutarch, and that the book of Acts was kind of this veiled message that was actually a warning about Paul. And I found it later on, I found that in the Clementine recognitions, they made some references to some statues or some artwork that was created by Plutarch. So there seems to be Plutarch popping up a lot in some of this early Christian literature, and this would be especially interesting to me if Plutarch is Luke, and the author of this book that I was quoting from in that previous video I mentioned, that was kind of their point. It was they thought that Plutarch was Luke. And they made a pretty good case for that being true. So I ran across this on Wikipedia because what I was looking for is I was trying to figure out if Serapis was a god of fortresses. Now, I do think it's just as likely, as we'll see later on, that one of the qualities of this Roman army, one of the things that they did was that they would worship their war standards. So this eagle guidon mounted on a pole that they led before their troops, that they would actually make sacrifices to this as if it were a god. So it could very well be that this god of fortresses he was worshiping could be this, these gods of war, which was essentially the Roman standard. But Plutarch says something which was very interesting. It said, according to Plutarch, Ptolemy stole the cult statue from Sinope in Asia Minor, having been instructed in a dream by the, quote, unknown god to bring the statue to Alexandria, where the statue was pronounced to be Serapis by two religious experts. So, this Serapis, that was apparently like the patron god of Vespasian, who was working miracles through Vespasian, is also the God that in Acts 17:23 that Paul said, "This is the God that I serve, this unknown God." And so he was pointing at this pagan altar, or he wasn't pointing to it, he was reminiscing about seeing it, this pagan altar, and there wasn't actually a god, an idol, at this altar. I've seen a photo of it. So this unknown god was like a statue of a man. Kind of looked like Santa Claus. But apparently Ptolemy stole this statue of the unknown god and took it to Egypt and renamed it Serapis. And so, like I said, like if I were to point to a pagan god and say, "Oh, this is the God I serve, this is the God that created the heaven and earth," everyone would think, "Oh, he's talking about Yahweh." Everyone would call me a heretic. But if Paul does it, everyone is okay with it, and everyone's like, "Oh yeah, that's Paul, so he's allowed to point to a pagan statue and say, 'This is the God that I serve, this is Yahweh.'" If I were to do it, I would be a heretic, but Paul can do it and get away with it, and everybody says that Paul's a legitimate apostle and should be worshipped above Yeshua, certainly believed above Yeshua. So the same God that Paul said that he serves was taken by Ptolemy and renamed into Serapis, and Serapis was the god that Vespasian conquered Jerusalem by. Now, if you can make this connection, then, and you could say that Yahweh is saying in the book of Revelation, he is saying that Satan is the being that came through and destroyed Jerusalem, or destroyed Judea, when it was actually Vespasian doing it. So in other words, I would say that what Yahweh is saying is that Serapis is Satan, that this patron god of Vespasian, whom Paul also serves, is Lucifer, is Satan. And of course, Lucifer, his name literally means, I believe, like the light bearer. And what does Paul say when Paul saw Paul's God that he called Jesus Christ, which I don't believe was Jesus? Paul talks about this bright light. It was so bright that it blinded him. So I think we've identified who Paul serves. But I found this very interesting, this quote by Plutarch. Also, there was in the book of Daniel, it said that this king of the north would divide the land for a price. And of course, here you can see from Josephus' Wars, book 7, that Caesar, and at the time that Josephus is talking about, Caesar in this instance is Vespasian, declared that Judea should be exposed to sale. Okay, so we're going to go back to the book of Daniel again. We're going to finish out this prophecy at the end of Daniel 11. Again, this king of the north would be Vespasian, if Mr. Driscoll is correct, and I think he is correct about that. He theorizes that the king of the south represents the kind of this personification of the three different factions that were fighting for control of Jerusalem. I'm not necessarily sure that I don't know about the whole King of the South part. That the King of the South is kind of like this representative of the three different factions fighting for control of Jerusalem. But I can't say I completely disagree with it. It says at the time of the end shall the kings of the south contend with him. Shall the king of the south contend with him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships, and he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass through. He shall enter again into the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown, but these shall be delivered out of his hand: Edom and Moab, and the chief of the children of Ammon. He shall stretch out his hand also on the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. But he shall have power over the treasures of gold and silver, over all the precious things of Egypt, and the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall be at his steps. But news out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him, and he shall go out with great fury to destroy and utterly sweep away many. He shall plant the tents of his palace between the sea and the glorious holy mountain. So Vespasian's generals often camped at Ptolemais and Caesarea, which would have been between the Zion being Jerusalem and the Mediterranean. So that verse 45 would certainly make sense. Yet he shall come to his end, and no one shall help him. So this finishes out chapter 11 of Daniel. Then we move on to 12, and this is where we see Michael mentioned. At that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince who stands for the children of your people, and there shall be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time. And at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone who shall be found written in the book. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who are wise shall shine as the brightness of the expanse, and those who turn many to righteousness as the stars forever and ever. But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book, even to the time of the end. Many shall run back and forth, and knowledge shall be increased. So, again, this is about the time of the end, meaning the end of Jerusalem, and so then you move into the latter days, which is what we're in now. It says, Then I, Daniel, looked, and behold, two others stood, one on the riverbank on this side, and the other on the riverbank on that side. One said to the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, How long shall it be to the end of these wonders? I heard the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, when he held up his right hand and his left hand to heaven, and swore by him who lives forever that it shall be for a time, times and a half. And when they had made an end of breaking in pieces the power of his holy people, all these things shall be finished. I heard, but I didn't understand. Then I said, My Lord, what shall be the issue of these things? So, just to mention on this time, times and a half, if the time is a year, so you got time, 1 year, times 2 years and a half, for a total of 3.5 years. If we figure a year as being the prophetic number of 360, then 3.5 years, of course, is the 1260 days that is mentioned in Revelation 12, when it said the woman shall be nourished for 1260 days in the wilderness. And it goes on to say, he said, "Go your way, Daniel, for the words are shut up and sealed until the time of the end. Many shall purify themselves and make themselves white and be refined, and the wicked shall do wickedly. And none of the wicked shall understand, but those who are wise shall understand. From the time that the continual burnt offering shall be taken away, and the abomination that makes desolate set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Blessed is he who waits and comes to the 1,335 days. But go you your way until the end, for you shall rest, and shall stand in your lot at the end of the days." So here you have another similar number, 1,290 days. And, of course, the 1,335 days. Now, we can actually figure out these two timelines here. So we know the day that the sacrifice ended. Josephus records, "And now Titus gave orders to his soldiers that were with him to dig up the foundations of the tower at Antonia and to make him a ready passage for his army to come up, while he himself had Josephus brought to him, for he had been informed on that very day, which was the 17th day of Panemus, which it was Tammuz, the sacrifice called the daily sacrifice had failed and had not been offered to God, for want of men to offer it, and that the people were grievously troubled at it. And he commanded him to say the same things to John that he had said before." So you have Titus calling for Vespasian calling for Josephus, and Josephus records that this day was the 17th day of Tammuz, and that's when the sacrifices ended. So this starts the timeline. This starts the 1,290 days, and the I think 1,335 days. So the 1,290 days after the sacrifices were stopped is also recorded. So Josephus says, "So Titus retired into the tower of Antonia and resolved to storm the temple the next day early in the morning with his whole army, and to encamp round about the holy house. But as for that house, God had for certain long ago doomed it to fire, and now that fatal day was come, according to the revolution of ages, it was the 10th day of the month Luz, or Av, in which it was formerly burnt by the king of Babylon." So this is the 10th day, 1,290 days later, 3.5 years after the previous statement about the sacrifices being taken away. And now the Romans, so what happens then is that the abomination of desolation is set up, and that is also recorded. It says, "And now the Romans, upon the flight of the seditious into the city, and upon the burning of the holy house itself, and of all the buildings round about it, brought their ensigns into the temple, and set them over against the eastern gate, and there they made sacrifices to it, and there they did make Titus imperator with the greatest acclamations of joy." So this abomination of desolation was that the Romans were making sacrifices to their standards, to their war symbols. So here you have the prophecy of Daniel fulfilled in that. And as for the 1,335 days, that was the storming of Masada. So in Masada, it was full of hundreds of people, and the men in Masada they killed everyone. They killed. So the Jewish men that were there in Masada with their families, they slaughtered their families. They killed all the children, all the women, because they didn't want them to be captured by the Romans. In fact, they elected 10 men to be the last standing, and so these 10 men killed everyone else, and then these 10 men took turns killing each other till there was one person left, and then he killed himself. So all of these people in Masada committed suicide. It says, so these people in Masada died with this intention, that they would not leave so much as one soul among them all alive to be subject to the Romans. Yet was there an ancient woman, and another, who was of kin to Eleazar, and superior to most women in prudence and learning, with 5 children, who had concealed themselves in caverns underground, and had carried water thither for their drink, and were hidden there, when the rest were intent upon the slaughter of one another. Those others were 960 in number, the women and children being withal included in that computation. This calamitous slaughter was made on the 15th day of the month of Nisan. So here you have, blessed is he who makes it to the 1335 days. After the 1335 days, that was pretty much the end of the war. And as far as Masada goes, the only people that survived was the woman who was hiding herself and the 5 children. Everyone else, killed themselves. Okay, so back to Revelation 12. When the dragon saw that he was thrown down to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. So he was persecuting Zion. 2 wings of the great eagle were given to the woman, that she might fly into the wilderness to her place, that she might be nourished for time and times and half a time. Again, referring back to Daniel. From the face of the serpent. The serpent spewed water out of his mouth after the woman like a river, that he might cause her to be carried away by the stream. The earth helped the woman, and the earth opened his mouth and swallowed up the river, which the dragon spewed out of his mouth. So again, the water represents a big mass of people. The earth is the lower, like the common people, the lowest, as far as like the classes of people, like the lowest class of people, the plebeians, in Rome, for instance, that would be the earth. So the dragon grew angry with the woman and went away to make war with the rest of her seed, who keep God's commandments and hold Yeshua's testimony. Josephus also kind of gives us a clue about this, too. So I guess I'll start off with this by mentioning here in Josephus' War, Book 4, 9:1, it says, "And now, the war having gone through all the mountainous country and all the plain country also, those that were at Jerusalem were deprived of the liberty of going out of the city, for as such as had a mind to desert, they watched the zealots, and they were watched by the zealots, and as to such, they were not yet on the side of the Romans. The army kept them in, encompassing the city round on all sides." So here you kind of have this description by Josephus of once the army encompassed the entire city, then no one could leave. And this obviously brings to mind Luke 21, where it says, "When you see Jerusalem encircled by armies, then know that its desolation is at hand. Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are in the midst of her depart. Let those who are in the country not enter therein. For these are the days of vengeance, and all things which are written may be fulfilled." Now, in Luke, Yeshua goes on to say, "Woe to those who are pregnant, those nursing infants in those days, for there shall be great distress in the land and wrath to his people. They will fall by the edge of the sword, be led away captive into all nations. Jerusalem will be trampled down by the Gentiles until the time the Gentiles are fulfilled." So, from the description in of Luke, once Jerusalem is surrounded, is pretty much over. There's no escape. Have a little bit different details in Matthew 24. It says, "When you see the abomination of desolation spoken of through Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who's on the housetop not go down and take out things that are in his house. Let he whose him is in the field not return back to get his clothes. But woe to those who are with child and nursing mothers in those days. Pray that your flight will not be in the winter nor a Sabbath, for then there will be great oppression, such as not been from the beginning of the world until now, nor will there ever be." So the point that he's making here in Matthew 24 is that you have to do it quickly. You don't go, you don't come out down off your rooftop and go in to get your stuff. You just need to go. Just when you see this, you need to flee. There, you don't waste time. You don't. To me, it reminds me of Lot when he's told to flee from Sodom, and he wants to, go ask other people to come with him, and he's kind of, procrastinating, and finally the angels just take him by the hand and drag him out of the city. I think it's kind of the same thing. Like, you don't have time to go and try and get your neighbor to come with you or get all your possessions or do any of that kind of crap. You have to get out quickly. That's the point that Yeshua is making here. When you see this, flee. Don't wait. Don't hesitate. You need to flee immediately. Josephus describes this time. He says, "Nor could anyone escape unless he were very inconsiderable, either on account of the meanness of his birth or on account of his fortune." So what's going on is that the zealots are not letting people out of the city. People are wanting to flee. No one can unless they are very poor. So, of course, the early Christians were known as the Edomites, the poor. I mean, Edomite means not even like they're poor. It means like you're poverty-stricken, like you're like homeless people, like as poor as you can possibly be, impoverished. And it was probably like a derogatory type of statement initially. But the only people that could get out at this point, there was a brief window where the only people who could leave were the poor, the deplorables. They could get out of the city, the people that had no money at all. But then that door closed very quickly. And as it's just like a couple of chapters later, Josephus is describing it and saying that the only people that could leave were the very rich, because they had to basically buy their freedom. So the rich purchased their flight by money, while none but the poor were slain. So again, Yeshua says you have to go immediately, because that window was very short. You had to get out immediately. If you didn't, then the terms flipped, and so it was no longer the poor that could get out. It was only the very wealthy that could get out. Okay, so then now you have some people coming out of Jerusalem, and they actually are being caught by Vespasian. And they're telling Vespasian. It says these things were told by Vespasian by deserters, for although the seditious watched all the passages out of the city and destroyed all, whosoever they were that came thither, yet there were some that had concealed themselves, and when they had fled to the Romans, persuaded their general to come to the city's assistance. So you have these Judeans who are begging for Vespasian to come and help the people in the city who are not the rebels, because basically the groups like the Sicarii and the Zealots and these more extremist factions within Jerusalem were holding people hostage, more or less. They're not letting them leave the city. So the people are begging Vespasian now to come to their assistance and save the remainder of the people, informing him withal that it was upon account of the people's goodwill toward the Romans that many of them were already killed, and the survivors in danger of the same treatment. So anyone still loyal to Rome was being slaughtered in the city. Vespasian did indeed already pity the calamities these men were in, and arose in appearance as though he was going to besiege Jerusalem, but in reality to deliver them from a worse siege they were already under. However, so it looks like Vespasian is getting his troops together, like he's going to go help the people in the city. However, he changed his mind. It says, however, he was obliged first to overthrow what remained elsewhere, and to leave nothing out of Jerusalem behind that it might interrupt him in that siege. So when it says that the dragon then turned and was in a rage when he saw he'd been thrown to earth, and went to make war off with the rest of the seed of the woman, this is probably that instance where Vespasian turns and goes back out into the countryside of Judea, looking to kind of finish off the people out there. And he goes to several different cities, destroying them. But then when they came to Jericho, they ran into this great multitude which prevented their approach. And so there was this huge mass of people coming out, this kind of poor, raggedy-looking group of people coming out of Jericho. They were fleeing to the mountainous parts that lay over against Jerusalem. While that part which was left behind was a great measure destroyed, they also found the city desolate. So Jericho ended up being more or less abandoned. But the point is, the Roman army couldn't advance any further because there were so many people, this huge multitude of people. So this would have been the earth that swallowing up the children of Zion. Because if you'll notice, the blue dot at the bottom, that is Jerusalem, and then you have Jericho circled in red. So the Roman army would have been that red arrow going toward Jericho. And there were people coming out of Jericho going into the mountains to the east, while at the same time you had these groups fleeing to Pella coming out of Jerusalem, which would be the blue arrow coming out of Jerusalem and going up to Pella. So this would have been the flight to Pella, and notice that you had this crowd coming out of Jericho that was a shield to the flight of the Edomites coming out of Jerusalem. So it's like this huge mass of people coming out of Jerusalem were now, interspersed, intermingled with this group coming out of Jericho, and this huge crowd of people is what stopped the Roman army. And this was the earth swallowing up, opened its mouth, and it swallowed up the river. It stopped the mass of Roman soldiers. So this is the literal fulfillment of that description in Revelation chapter 12. And that brings us to the end of the chapter. I pray that this has been a blessing to you. I thank you for listening. And we'll pick it up in chapter 13 next time. Thank you. Shalom.